Hello to all technology enthusiasts. Welcome to another episode of the technology section of the Savadestan Ask podcast series. I am Reza Khademian, proudly hosting you in this podcast, and Mr. Barjani is our guest and one of the technology enthusiasts joining us. Well, today we want to talk about one of the most crucial components of any computer system, a part that has a primary and essential role in the system. This component is the CPU, or the processor, and we want to discuss it in detail. So I suggest you to stay with us until the end of this podcast. Hello, Mr. Barjani.
Hello, Mr. Khademian, and greetings to all our dear listeners. I'm very happy to be here again and have a conversation with you.
You're welcome. We are also glad to have you here with us. Well, Mr. Barjani, could you give us a general explanation of the processor to start?
Certainly, the processor or central processing unit, CPU, is the computer's central processing unit that manages the execution of all instruction and is often referred to as the computer's brain. The CPU is a vital component in every computer, responsible for managing all the computation and instruction transferred to other compute components and somehow peripherals. Almost all electronic devices and gadgets you use, from desktops and laptops to phone and gaming consoles and smartwatch, are equipped with a central processing unit. In fact, this unit serves as the foundation of computers. The speed of the central processing unit is determined by the input instructions, and computer components only gain processing power when connected to this unit. A central processing unit manages data from all parts of the computer simultaneously. With an increase in computational tasks, this may slow down or even crash the higher workload. The most common central processing unit in the market today is integrated circuit-based component, available in various types, and leading manufacturers in this industry are AMD and Intel, competing with each other for the last 50 years.
Well, a question that might come to the minds of our listeners is how the processing process is carried out in these processors. Could you elaborate on that?
That's an interesting question, and it has an interesting answer. The process of executing instruction in the processor involves four main stages. The first is the fetch stage, where instructions are fetched from memory. The processor first receives these instructions from memory to understand how to manage input and to be aware of the relevant instructions. This put may be one of or an infinite number of instructions that needs to be addressed separately. For this purpose, there is a unit called program counter, which keeps track of the order sent instructions. The processor is always in communication with RAM to find the address of the instruction. The second stage is decoding instruction translation. The instructions are translated into form that processor can understand, machine language or binary. After receiving the instructions, the process needs to translate from them into a language, binary, which it comprehends. Writing programs in binary from the beginning is a challenging task. So codes are written in simpler programming language, and then a unit called the assembler translates these codes into executable and ready to process code. The third stage is the execution of translated instructions. The most important stage in the process's operation is the processing and execution of instructions. In this stage, the decoded and binary instructions are processed using the arithmetic logic unit ALU, or the calculation and logic unit at the specific processing addresses. The fourth and final stage is storing the results of execution. The results and outputs of the instructions are stored in auxiliary register in the processor's peripheral memory so that they can be referred in future instructions to increase speed. This process, known as the fetch execute cycle, happens millions of times per second, which is somehow in the direct relation to the process. After completing these four main stages, the next instruction is executed, and all the stages are repeated from the beginning until all instructions are processed.
How fascinating! Well, can you provide us with some information about the architecture of processors?
Yes, of course. The relationship between instructions and hardware design shapes the architecture of the processor. But before we delve into the processor's architecture, let me give you a brief history of the processors.
Yes, please, certainly. Histories can be interesting and informative for everyone.
Absolutely. Histories are always like that. In 1823, a person named Baron Johannes Jacobs Berzelius discovered the chemical element silicon, symbol Si, atomic number 14, for the first time. This element, due to its abundance and strong semiconductor properties, is used as the main material in the construction of processors and computer chips. Almost a century later, 1947, John Barjani, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley invented the first transistor in the Bell Labs, earning them the Nobel Prize. The first efficient integrated circuit, or IC, was unveiled in September 1958, and 2 years later, IBM developed its own automated mass production center for transistors in New York. Intel was founded in 1968 and AMD was established a year later. The first microprocessor was invented in the early 1970s by Intel. These processors, named Intel 4004, had 2300 transistors and could perform 60,000 operations per second. The 4004 was sold for $20 and had only 640 bytes of memory. Following Intel, Motorola introduced its first 8-bit processor, MC6800, with a frequency of 1 to 2 MHz. Subsequently, MOS technology introduced a faster and more affordable processor that exists, one which was used in gaming consoles of that time, such as the Atari 2600 and computer systems like Apple II and Commodore 64. Motorola developed the first 32-byte processor in 1979, which was used only in Apple Macintosh computers and Amiga systems. Soon after, National Semiconductor introduced the first 32-byte processor for general use. In 1993, PowerPC introduced its first 32-byte instruction set architecture program. Developed by AIM Alliance, composed of Apple, IBM, and Motorola, Apple migrated from Intel to PowerPC at the time. There are two processor architecture models known as 32-byte architecture and 64-byte architecture. The difference between 62 and 40, or let's say 64, is essentially related to their different access to RAM. The maximum physical memory of 32 architecture is limited to 4 GB, while the other can access physical memory to 6, 10, or 8, or even 32 GB. A 64-bit computer can run both 32-byte and 64-byte programs, whereas the other can only execute 32 bytes program. In most cases, 64-byte processors are more efficient when processing extensive data composed to 32. However, With advancement in processor technology, the capacity and capability of 64 have also increased. In addition to 64 and 32, there is another architecture called ARM. ARM is a type of computer processor architecture introduced in 1980 by Aparat. Before ARM, both AMD and Intel used a 32 bytes architecture based on complex instruction set computer, which is CISC. And IBM utilized reduced instruction set computing, which is RISC, in its workstations. Akron was the first company to develop a home computer based on RISC computation and named its architecture after its own name, ARM. Akron later renamed Advanced and did not produce processors but instead sold licenses for the use of ARM to other manufacturers.
Can you explain the difference between ARM architecture with 32 and 64 bits?
ARM architecture is designed to be as simple as possible while minimizing energy consumption. In contrast, Intel 32X architecture uses more complex settings suitable for more powerful desktop and laptop processors. After Intel introduced 64 architecture, computers moved toward 64 for optimal computation, better 3D rendering, and faster encryption. Both ARM and 32 architectures now support 64 instructions, but the technology was introduced earlier for mobile devices. ARM, when implementing the 64 architecture in ARM version 8, adopted two approaches: AARCH32 for executing 32-byte code and AARCH64 for executing 64-byte code.
That's interesting. Well, can you provide some information about processor frequencies?
One of the crucial factors in choosing and buying a processor is its frequency, commonly referred to as clock speed. This is a constant number for all cores of a processor, indicating the number of operations the processor performs per second. It is measured in hertz, usually in megahertz or gigahertz. More precisely, frequency refers to the number of computational cycles that processor's core perform in 1 second, measured in gigahertz.
What about cache memory? Can you give us an explanation about that?
Another factor affecting the processor performance is the processor cache memory. This type of memory, due to its proximity to the processor, operates much faster than the system's main memory. The processor uses cache to temporarily store data, reducing the time it takes to transfer data to or from the system memory. Therefore, cache can have a significant impact on processor performance, and the larger the capacity of the processor cache memory, the better the performance. Fortunately, nowadays, users can access benchmarking tools to evaluate process performance independently of manufacturers' claim.
Now let's move on to the most important part, processors, which we all differentiate based on the number of processor cores. Thank you for providing an explanation on this topic.
A core is a processing unit of a processor that can independently perform all computational tasks or processes. From this perspective, a core can be considered as a small processor with the central processing unit, CPU. This part of the processor consists of operational logical units, memory control, and registers that execute instruction processing through the fetch-execute cycle. Initially, processors worked with only one core, but nowadays, processors are mostly multi-core, processing 2 or more cores in a single integrated circuit, handling multiple tasks or processors simultaneously. It's important to note that each core can only execute one instruction at a time. Processors with multiple cores execute sets of instructions or programs faster through parallel computing. However, having more cores does not necessarily mean an overall increase in process efficiency. as many programs still do not utilize parallel processing. Processors are categorized based on the number of cores, such as single core, dual core, quad core, octa core, or deca core.
So when they say Core i3, Core i5, or Core i7, they are not referring to the number of processor cores.
That's a very interesting question, and many people have misconceptions about the Core i indicates the number of processors core. Simply put, Core i7 processors are often faster than Core i5, and similarly, Core i5 processors are faster than Core i3. The numbers 7, 5, and 3 do not correlate with the number of cores, but rather indicate the processing power of the processors in each series compared to their preceders. The processing power of each processor depends on various factors, including the number of cores, clock speed, cache size, and technologies like turbo boost and hyper-threading.
And for the last question, what is your recommendation for purchasing a balanced system in terms of the processor?
In gaming or graphic-intensive tasks, when the graphics card is not fully utilized, the impact of the processor power can enhance the user's gaming experience will be noticeable if there is a high coordination between the graphics and the processor. In addition, the type and model of the game are also crucial factors in choosing hardware. Currently, quad-core processors are still suitable for running various games, but processors with 8 cores or more undoubtedly provides a smoother program. Multi-core processors are essential for modern games like first-person shooters or online multiplayer games, making them a requirement for any gaming system.
Thank you very much for your valuable explanations, Mr. Barjani. I hope those seeking information about processors, especially their overall performance, have found sufficient knowledge. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome. I'm glad I could be a service to you and our dear listeners here. I hope this information proves useful to our audience. Until we meet again.
Goodbye. Well, another one of our podcasts in the field of technology, and this time about processors with our dear guest Mr. Ali Barjani, comes to an end here. I hope by sharing this information, those interested in the field of technology have benefited from it. As always, we eagerly await your comments and suggestions on our social media networks at Savadestan Ask. If there's a topic you'd like us to discuss, feel free to share it with us. Until the next podcast, farewell.